So this is Love, Chapter 25. At last, Duchess Genevieve retired for her afternoon nap, and Cinderella tiptoed out of the bedchamber and quietly shut the door. Behind her, Bruno nipped at her ankles and let out a low wolf. Her Highness is asleep. She placed a finger on her lips. Be good now. I'll be back soon. After filling Bruno's water bowl, Cinderella tore off her wig and undid her apron. She needed to freshen up in her chambers before meeting Charles, but attending to the Duchess, as well as taking over Amelia's chores, had taken all morning and afternoon. It was already past 4. After bidding goodbye to Bruno, she raced for her quarters. Well, servants weren't exactly permitted to race across the palace, but Cinderella did her best. Her heels clicked at a brisk tempo against the wooden parquet, her steps a steady counterpoint to the unsteady beat of her heart. She hadn't known her heart could dance, but here it was, beating in a maddening rhythm that thumped in her chest and buzzed in her ears. It didn't slow as she changed in her room, so filled was she with the idea of a fresh start. And as her mind whirled, she realized there was one person she wanted to tell, one whose life could change just as much as hers. Fairy godmother, Lenore, Cinderella whispered as she looked into the mirror. There was no answer. Perhaps the fairy had borrowed too much magic and could not get to her. Cinderella went on, hoping her godmother could hear her from wherever she was. All is well now, between the prince and me, and I haven't forgotten about you. I'm going to tell Charles about the ban on magic. Once he hears more about the situation, I know he'll confront the Grand Duke and talk to his father about reversing it. Cinderella paused, gently touching the mirror with her fingertips to seal her promise. Then she made her way out of the servants' quarters, ready to meet the prince. She did not know what the afternoon would bring, but she had more hope in her heart than she'd had in a very long time. She was just rounding the hallway with the portraits when she heard it, a familiar voice calling her name. Cinderella, Cinderella! Startled, Cinderella came to a stop. The gallery was empty. Where was the voice coming from? Lenore, she whispered, is that you? The painting to her right shimmered. It was one she had noticed before, of Genevieve and Arthur, and the voice seemed to be coming from the volume under the Duke of Orleans' arm, with the obscured title Enchantments. Yes, whispered her fairy godmother. Her voice was tremulous and faint. My child, did you hear me earlier? I have such wonderful news. About Charles, she blushed. I mean the prince. He knows it's me at the ball, and I think he cares for me. He'll help you, I know it. Oh, my dear, I know you think you've solved it, but perhaps you need to know more about what happened, why magic is forbidden. Cinderella drew closer. She couldn't see Lenore, but the outline of a pearly white hand glimmered from the spine of the painted book. Her godmother was there. I'm listening. Years ago, when the queen was born, all the high fairies of Aurelis blessed her with gifts: beauty, charm, grace, kindness, wit, and lastly, selflessness. As she grew up, she brought joy to everyone who met her, most of all to the king. But there were those who sought to take advantage of her kindness, the Grand Duke's father being one of them. One winter, a terrible fever spread across the kingdom. Out of the goodness of her heart, the queen sent all the royal physicians to look after the people. There weren't enough doctors, so on some days she went too. Then things worsened, and the fever took her. Cinderella drew a sharp breath. Poor Charles. It was a dark time, Lenore continued. The Grand Duke's father took the advantage of the king's grief. For years he'd been threatened by the power fairies possessed, by the influence we could have on the court. He took advantage of the growing distrust and fear already rampant in the kingdom against our kind. He blamed us for making the queen too kind, too selfless. Rallying those who were already rounding up and executing fairies, he hunted the high fairies who had blessed the queen and destroyed their wands. The king, distraught, listened, and he forbade magic in Aurelius and banished all fairies, warning them that if we ever returned, not only would our wands be broken, we would be imprisoned for life. Her voice deepened. That is why we have been living in exile. Oh, Lenore, Cinderella whispered, I'm sorry. I tell you this only so you are careful, my child, said her godmother. There are those in this castle who are very content with the way things stand, the present Grand Duke being one of them. I have heard that he has taken up his father's causes with gusto. What about the Duke and Duchess of Orleans? Cinderella asked. I found something in the library that I think they wrote to one another years ago about trying to help. Lenore smiled sadly. The Duke of Orleans did his best to fight the ruling, and he lost much of his support in the council doing so. He and the Duchess warned many fairies when the Grand Duke would begin his hunt. The Duchess is back now, said Cinderella. She could help, and the Prince? Cinderella couldn't give up the idea that things could be different for all of them. Lenore's voice brightened slightly. The prince's love is what you deserve, my dear. But the duke will be suspicious of you once he learns of Charles's affections. Even more so if you start talking about magic. Be happy and keep yourself safe. Do not interfere. But fairy godmother, The grandfather clock at the end of the hall began to chime, cutting off Cinderella's reply. She glanced back, making sure no one else had entered the hall. They were still alone, but when Cinderella turned back, the painting had gone still. I'm going to help you, she promised. Charles was waiting for her in the glass conservatory before the garden entrance. He started when their gazes met, lurching slightly forward and nearly tripping over his shoes. Cinderella chuckled, and the prince's eyes filled with mirth. I'm sorry to keep you waiting, she began. Her voice trailed as she remembered what Lenore had said about his mother. She wanted to ask him about magic, but Lenore's warning to be careful was fresh in her mind. She'd wait until they were outside of the palace and out of the range of the Duke, with his ears everywhere. I got a little sidetracked in the gallery, and here I thought Aunt Genevieve was the one keeping you, Charles teased. She did give me a few extra chores, said Cinderella, grateful when he didn't ask if she had told the Duchess yet that she was his intended bride. I don't think she's very happy with me right now. I brought her the wrong type of tea 3 times. She blushed sheepishly, and his smile widened. Her stomach gave a pleasant flutter. She smiled back at him. I guess my mind was somewhere else. I've become quite familiar with the feeling, confessed Charles, gesturing at his clothes. I might have put this shirt on backwards twice today. You, she said playfully. I assumed you had a valet who dressed you. Maybe 2. Since the day I was born, replied Charles in a serious tone. Really? No, he chuckled. I'm quite capable of dressing myself. Sometimes I worry it's the only thing I'll be capable of. Though he tried to hide it, a note of melancholy colored the prince's last words. You sound worried, said Cinderella softly. I am, Charles murmured. So much has changed. It's funny. The thought of one's parents getting old. When we're children, they worry so about us. Now I feel like things have reversed, and soon I'll be expected to take on his responsibilities. I don't know if I'm ready. Before Cinderella could reply, Charles brightened and gestured to the garden doors. But we've lingered here long enough. Come, there's so much I want to show you. Where are the guards? Asked Cinderella. She'd been nervous about coming to this part of the castle, half expecting the guards wouldn't permit her outside, but she hadn't come across a single one. I dismissed them. As of today, anyone in the palace is welcome to enjoy the gardens. Cinderella's eyes widened. Do you mean that? By royal decree of the crown prince. With a flourish, Charles stepped aside, revealing a new sign he'd posted on the glass door. By royal command, Cinderella read, every person in the palace, whether a member of the royal household, a guest of His Majesty the King, or a retainer of the crown, hereby shall be permitted access to the royal gardens. She clasped her hands, muttering her enthusiasm. It's very nice. But something was still missing, and it showed on her face. What is it? Asked the prince. Every person in the palace, she repeated. Why not everyone in Aurelius, or anyone at all? Surely not anyone can walk into the palace, said Charles, confused. Valours doesn't have a public garden, Cinderella explained. In the palace, one of the reasons I dreamed of going to the ball was because I spent all my life staring up at it. Opening the gardens would give everyone a glimpse of the palace of their ruler, even if it was just part of the garden. You have a point. I'll bring it up with my father. How is that? Her smile widened, and that was all the response he needed. Taking the prince's outstretched arm, Cinderella stepped through the double doors into the gardens. It was nearly sundown, and a soft glow bathed the flowers. This way, Charles said, gesturing at the wooden bridge over a pond. When do you have to be back? To the Duchess, Cinderella repeated. I hope she doesn't mind my telling you her naps are usually an hour long. Then that's just enough time. 4? A surprise, replied the prince, guiding her through a garden of fluted lilies. Across the lilies was a pond, Its water is a brilliant, vibrant green from the reflecting in trees around it. In the center of the pond swam two elegant white birds, their long necks curved toward one another. Swans, Cinderella breathed. She leaned against the bridge's rail and gazed at the pair of swans gliding across the pond. At her side, Charles rested his elbows on the bridge. They're here every evening before sundown. Sometimes during sunset, you can see the light dapple their feathers. Look! Rays of golden light stroked the swan's wings, which shimmered against the still waters. I used to come here whenever I could to watch them, said Prince Charles. I'm certain it's been the very same pair of swans for years. When I saw them, I felt a little less lonely. How happy they look, mused Cinderella, watching as the swans took flight and their feet skidding across the pond before they soared into the sky, free to come and go as they please. She watched them weave through the clouds until they finally disappeared. What are you thinking about? Asked the prince. Once they fall in love, they stay in love forever, Cinderella murmured, repeating what he told her at the masquerade. My parents had a love like that, always laughing together, telling each other stories, and dancing with me in the middle. My mother was the one who taught me how to waltz and to sing. Cinderella started for one of the trees on the other side of the bridge. There used to be a swing in the family garden, one hanging from a sturdy oak tree, just like this one. Mamma would sit on it and sing about the sweet nightingale perching on the branches above her. Sometimes she'd put me on her lap, and my papa would push the two of us toward the sky. When I got older, birds used to sit outside my windows too. The same ones every day. I'd listen to them before starting my chores. Your chores? Cinderella faltered. She hadn't meant to bring up that aspect of her past, but she trusted him enough to tell him the truth. Yes, after my father passed away, my stepmother dismissed the household staff to help make ends meet. Her stepdaughters took my bedroom and my clothes, and I became their servant. She placed her hand on his, anticipating his reaction. It's in the past now. I'm happy, and I'm definitely not lonely anymore. I have Louisa. She's the first friend I've had in years, aside from my dog Bruno, and the mice in my stepmother's house. And now I have you. Charles entwined his fingers with hers. My parents don't have any other children, he mused. And father was always busy in meetings with the council. I didn't have many friends, but I encountered a few wise professors and learned to love my studies. I spent hours every day in the library. Books became my friends because I didn't have real ones. I loved reading too, said Cinderella wistfully. My parents used to have a beautiful library. She omitted the fact that her stepmother had sold off many of the books. There'd be stories about the countries around us. I'd forgotten most of them until now. It's easy to forget how vast the world is and how little of it I've seen. I've never even been outside the capital. Then I'll bring you, Charles promised. I'll take you all around the world. We'll tour the neighboring kingdoms together. But I have to warn you, traveling as royalty isn't as grand as it looks. You mean you're not 30 courses at every meal and servants waiting on you hand and foot? Cinderella teased. Not always. Everything is always planned out for you. You don't get to choose where you want to go or what you want to do, but you do get to learn more about the world and see lots of operas and ballets. Cinderella covered her mouth, hiding a laugh. To anyone else, that would sound wonderful, especially the ballet. I haven't been to one since I was a little girl, but I can easily do without the 30-course meal and the servants. Prince Charles grimaced. I'm sounding spoiled, aren't I? You grew up being told to act, what to wear, what to say, where to go, and what to eat. I understand that. It wasn't so different for me. He shook his hand. He took her hand. It is silly feeling sorry for a prince, but up until now I had never had a choice in anything. Before I left for school, the only time I left the palace was when I was out with my father on official business. Even when I did go out, I only saw a sliver of Aurelius. I should have gotten to know my country. I'll have to rule Aurelius one day, and everything I do will be scrutinized by my council and my people. If there's one freedom I'm determined to have, it's to choose who I love and marry. The warmth in his voice made Cinderella's stomach flip. Strange, they'd only been together for a few hours at the most, yet how familiar he was becoming to her. She looked into his eyes and suddenly feeling bold. I want to go everywhere with you, whether we get to choose where we go or not. She brightened, an idea hitting her. Louisa and I sneaked away to go to the masquerade. We could dress up as merchants when everyone's sleeping and slip out, she grinned. See what the real Aurelius, as you say. You mean it? Charles asked. When she nodded, he clasped her hands, bringing them to his chest. Let's start tonight. I'll try to get Aunt Genevieve to dismiss you early for the evening. Meet me by the coach house. I have some place I want to bring you. The coach house wasn't far from the stables, which Cinderella often passed on her morning walks with Bruno after she'd brought the Duchess breakfast. She hadn't paid much attention to it before, but it was where the royal carriages were kept. She had to be over a dozen carriages. There had to be over a dozen carriages, each with gilded trimmings along the doors, fine velvet upholstery, and thick blue flags. She didn't see the prince anywhere or any attendants. Charles, she called out. No answer. The coach house was empty. Cinderella walked toward the stables, wondering where the prince could be. He told her to wait outside the coach house on the path, but there, at the very end of the road, was a carriage that had none of the royal finishes. It was plain, with faded white paint peeling along the edges, and open windows instead of glass panes or curtains. In the driver's seat was a shadowy figure she couldn't make out in the dim lamplight. The wheels grumbled against the gravel path, and the horses nickered. The carriage stopped, and Cinderella gasped. The driver was Charles. Setting down the reins and climbing down from the front seat, he looked at her sheepishly, the slightest pink tinge coloring his cheeks. A driver's cap covered most of his black hair, and he wore a twill coat that was ever so slightly too boxy and large. But for his face, he was almost unrecognizable. I encouraged everyone to take the evening off, he explained, even though he hadn't asked for an explanation. He seemed nervous, which was oddly comforting. She was nervous, too. Don't be silly, she tried to reason with herself. There was nothing to worry about. And she knew who she was, a commoner, a former servant in her stepmother's house, and he didn't care in the least. So why was her heart racing? Because she was finally spending time with him, as herself instead of as the maiden with the glass slippers or the princess with the mask, and also because she still needed to ask him about her fairy godmother and whether he could help her return to Aurelius. Unaware of her thoughts, Charles gestured to the carriage. I hope you don't mind. Of course not. He started to open the door for her, but Cinderella shook her head. I'm sitting with you in the driver's seat. It's chilly out, he protested. She grabbed one of the blankets from inside the coach. Then, I'll wear this. Gathering the folds of her skirt in her hand, she climbed up to the carriage box, ignoring Charles's extended hand. It's rather high. Are you sure you don't? Cinderella plopped onto the seat and grinned down at him. She held out her hand to him. Do you need help getting up? Returning her grin, the prince took her hand and she helped him up into the driver's box. It was a tight and narrow space, made for a single driver and barely large enough to fit them both without their knees gazing one another's, and their arms so close they were practically linked, but Cinderella didn't mind. Maybe she hadn't needed the blanket after all. The warmth of his presence next to her was enough to make her cheeks burn. Where are we going? She asked, after he prodded the horses to begin moving. It's a surprise. Another surprise? You're spoiling me. Once all of Aurelius knows who you are, you won't have the luxury of going out. Maybe it won't be so bad. Perhaps, he allowed. But after word spread at school that I was the prince, everyone began asking me for favors for their family or avoiding me. Some of the students even hated me. Hated you? For being the prince? Charles's jaw clenched and he nodded. I don't blame them. Many people think the nobility holds too much power, too much wealth. Things have changed, Cinderella, but not enough. And they won't, not when men like Ferdinand are in charge. I thought your father was in charge. My father cares deeply for the people and the country, but as he's gotten older, I think he's lost sight of how to rule Aurelius. Too much time with the royal council, listening to men who eat with golden spoons and sleep on feather pillows. It was different when my mother was alive. How so? He loved her dearly, but they didn't always get along. Father has an explosive temper, you see, and he's stubborn as a bull. He and my mother would argue fiercely over how to govern Aurelius. She wanted him to focus more on the people rather than on pleasing the council. I remember during one argument, she called him a child for letting Ferdinand and the council influence his decisions instead of listening to his heart. I wanted to be a king who listens to his heart. He sighed. There I go, talking about politics when we should be talking about you. I want to hear it, Cinderella said, gazing at the city below them. Thousands of lamplights glittered beneath the hill, twinkling like a constellation of stars. Aurelius is my home, too. I've spent too many years trapped inside my stepmother's home, not knowing what's been happening around me. Then you will, promised the prince, but tonight is for us. Along the outskirts of Valours, Charles stopped their coach before an open-air theater. Here we are, he said nervously, tethering the horses to a nearby tree. It's just a rehearsal, but I've heard the dancers are even better than the royal ballets. I thought you might like it. I do, Cinderella marveled at the stage, a simple wooden platform surrounded by a crown of oak trees adorned with hundreds of candles. Half a dozen wagons and coaches were scattered across the field, other patrons who had known about the night's rehearsal. Closer to the stage were benches and makeshift chairs, each seat filled by someone raptly anxious for the ballet to begin. The orchestra was much smaller than the one that had played at the masquerade the night before, but its music sailed on the wind, carrying clear and true to Cinderella's ears. The ballet tonight is Dancing Princesses, announced the conductor before the overture began in earnest. Ooh, she breathed. You know the story? You don't? When the prince shook his head, she smiled. It's about 12 princesses who sneak out to dance in a magical fairyland. Their father is so distressed about it, he offers one prince's hand in marriage to anyone who will discover where they go each night. Charles raised an eyebrow. Is anyone able to solve the mystery? You'll have to watch the ballet to find out, Cinderella replied mischievously. It was one of my favorite stories growing up. Not anymore? No, when I was a child, I loved pretending to be a princess in a castle, waiting for some curse to befall me, and a handsome prince to break it. But as I got older, the feeling of being trapped was all too real. Her voice drifted. After Mama and Papa died, things changed. I realized that real life isn't a fairy tale. She threaded her arm through his. Sometimes it's for the better. It's funny. I used to pretend to be sick so I wouldn't have to go to the ballet. And when I did go, I'd fall asleep. My mother would laugh to see me going willingly. A flood of warmth radiated inside Cinderella's chest, and she teased, Are you going to fall asleep tonight? I have a wild guess. The company will make a difference. He spread a blanket over their laps. Under the moonlight, their hands brushed against each other. Besides, Father's royal box always smelled of stale cedar and politics. Both were very conducive to falling asleep. A gentle breeze tickled Cinderella's nape, and she shivered as she inhaled the fresh air. No stale cedar here, not the sweet undertone of perfume that usually pervaded the palace. She did catch a whiff of sugared nuts from a vendor closer to the stage, and the smell of horsehair, but she didn't mind. Politics doesn't have a smell. Oh, it does. I could never even hear the music because someone was always trying to get my father's ear. Someone like the Grand Duke? It was Ferdinand 90% of the time, admitted the prince. The mention of the Grand Duke made Cinderella's mood somber. She leaned forward, trying to relish in the music of the overture. Something's troubling you, Charles observed. Tell me. She bit her lip, glancing at the costumed ballerina waiting off stage. A few of them were dressed as fairies. Can I ask something of you? You may ask anything of me. My fairy godmother told me that magic was once a part of everyday life here in Aurelius, but now she and her kind have been banished. I'd like to help her return. Then we shall, Charles promised. I'm supposed to begin attending the council meeting shortly. I will bring it up the first chance I'm able. Warned by his answer, Cinderella started to reach for his hand, then hesitated. She didn't like the thought of keeping anything from him. My godmother also told me that the king banished her kind because of what happened with your mother. The prince's brow knit with confusion. What happened? You don't know, she said softly. She was sick. Many in the kingdom were. She and father sent me to the countryside that winter so I wouldn't fall ill. She swallowed. My fairy godmother said that your mother ordered all the royal physicians to leave the palace and treat those in need, that she joined them, and when she became ill, it was too late. The Grand Duke blamed her death on the kindness and selflessness that the fairies blessed her with when she was born. And then he convinced your father to exile all fairies from Aurelius. Charles' jaw tensed. I never knew, he said at last. Every time I asked my father, he refused to speak of her. Her death hurt him too much. A couple of ladies sitting a row ahead turned to look at them. Cinderella touched Charles's hand and lowered her voice. I understand if you've changed your mind about wanting to help. No, I haven't. My mother was the kindest person I ever met, and there isn't a day that I don't miss her. Charles inhaled a ragged breath. But from everything she ever told me about magic, I know that it doesn't make your choices for you. You would never have She would never have wanted my father to banish the fairies. She would never have let him unfairly persecute hundreds based on lies. The prince turned to her. Come with me to the next council meeting. I'll do whatever I must to convince my father to change the law. You can ask your fairy godmother to testify. No, it isn't safe for her. Not with the Grand Duke here. He was helping his father take advantage of yours back then. Surely he wouldn't want things to change now, but I will advocate for her if I can. Why am I not surprised that Ferdinand would have something to do with this? Charles gritted his teeth before giving her a small smile. Don't worry, Cinderella. We'll have a word with him. Cinderella squeezed his hand. Together. Together. Charles clasped her hand over his. The ballet was about to begin. Now I want to tell you something. I promised to show you the world, but I can't promise we'll have many nights like this with just the two of us. No royal guards watching and listening to everything we say and do, she joked. But Charles's face was still sober. I thought about what you said, that Aurelius has never had a commoner for a princess. Charles squeezed her hand. You will be the first. Cinderella exhaled. This had also been weighing on her heavily. I don't know the first thing about being a princess, how to walk or talk or protocol and etiquette are overrated, Charles interrupted, trying to reassure her. Who cares what fork should be used for asparagus or olives or oysters, or how one addresses a baroness versus a countess? But if that's what worries you, all the rules can be learned. What can't be learned is the happiness your laugh brings to those around you, or the way your eyes dance when you smile. It's no small thing I ask of you, he continued, and I would understand if you changed your mind, or if you need more time. Trying to untangle the emotions and thoughts inside her, Cinderella fell quiet. All this time, what had kept her from readily accepting Charles's proposal? Fear that she wouldn't be accepted, fear that he had fallen in love with the idea of the girl at the ball, not her, fear that she wasn't ready to make such a life-altering decision, not so soon after finally escaping her stepmother. But perhaps she was ready. If she listened to the strongest emotions bubbling around her heart, they urged her to be happy. Wasn't that what Lenore had taught her? Wasn't that the point of it all? There were so many things they had no control over, the pride and machinations of others, disease, death. Shouldn't they hold on to happiness when they had it? Already in these past few days, she'd been happier with Charles than she had in years. The answer was simple. I'm ready, she whispered, her stomach fluttering, as soon as the words left her. Charles looked at her, the light in his eyes wavering. Then, yes, she spoke over him, I accept. He drew her close, holding both her hands and bringing them to his lips. Wishing this moment could last forever, she leaned against the prince's shoulder. At last she knew. So this was love.